When you are ready, this rutted roadway will finally take you home.
The sequel to Red Hook Studios' acclaimed gothic horror-themed dungeon crawler, Darkest Dungeon, has been out in early access for a year now, and over that year, I've been following the development of the game with some interest, as someone who found the original game to be intriguing but not quite capable of drawing me in for very long. I made a video on my early impressions of Darkest Dungeon 2 way back when, but to sum it up, I think the sequel shifting toward a road trip structure where you build a team of heroes for each fresh run to be a more appealing approach to the series' brutal auto-saved permadeath mechanic. It never sat well with me that in the original Darkest Dungeon, you can spend hours building up a character only to lose them forever to a mistake or even just bad luck. And the sequel seems to understand that feeling, in that its deaths are only permanent on the level of an individual run, and not over the entire experience. There does seem to be an effort to bring back some of that high-risk, high-reward gameplay with one of the new progression mechanics, but as I understand it, the memory system is more designed for higher-end players who can consistently down the bosses that cap off each run, and I'm not quite there yet. I'm working on it, though. That brings me to the various updates that have been made to Darkest Dungeon 2 over its year in early access, which most recently include a full reworking of the game's progression system to give the player more interesting choices about investing in permanent upgrades. I have some minor gripes about how some of this is implemented, like, for example, that you have to unlock borderline essential items like reliable healing and stress healing options in a randomized lottery system. But overall, it's a change I enjoy, and I believe that the currency use of the Altar of Hope makes for an interesting addition in terms of risk and reward. Should you push on to the next inn to get more candles, even though your party's in bad shape and you risk losing most of them if you don't make it through the region? Should you just cash out when you've got enough candles for an upgrade you want? Do you risk fighting one of the challenging lair bosses for the chance to at least reach the mountain, after which you keep all the candles you've obtained in that run? And what about the Bounty Hunter? The Bounty Hunter is the first hero added to Darkest Dungeon 2 since it went live, and although he's not technically new in the sense that he's a returning hero from the first game, there's no doubt that he fulfills a unique role in your runs in that he joins midway through and only for a single region. Fortunately, he's both powerful and versatile, able to slot into any rank effectively, and he's usually pretty helpful when it's time to take care of a lair boss. I do sometimes wish he felt a little more integrated into the game, because the Bounty Hunter currently lacks interactions with several of DD2's mechanics, including hero shrines and the affinity system. But I have to wonder if that's because this is only the first pass, or if that's going to be an ongoing quirk of his, and whether or not that reflects on future heroes added down the line. I do at least hope that he eventually gets a choice of hero paths like the other characters, because I really enjoy that you can now select a path for each of your heroes at the crossroads instead of having them be randomized for each run, and the Bounty Hunter can feel a bit static without that feature, even after accounting for his having a few different builds depending on what rank you plan on using him in. While there are times when I choose not to hire the Bounty Hunter, either because I don't want to spend the candles or because I'm happy with my current setup, I still think it's important that the option to change up your team with him is there, even temporarily, as it can take around 2 or 3 hours of playing to reach the mountain, and all that time spent with the same 4 characters can start to feel a little stale after a while. Assuming, of course, that none of them died along the way and got replaced, because that can also happen. Darkest Dungeon 2 remains as brutal a game as ever, if not even more so, as successive additions to the ranks of the enemies you'll face and changes to the overall structure of each run have really ramped up the challenges you'll face on the way to the mountain. When the game first released, it was possible to avoid most of the major fights along the path and save your strength and resources for the big confession boss at the end, but now it's necessary to defeat one of the lair bosses to even reach the mountain, and the grotesque exemplar always bars the way to the final inn. There are plenty of other significant opponents thrown at you as well, sometimes unexpectedly in road battles like an encounter with the Antiquarian or even the Shambler boss from the first game. And those are in addition to the times when your party will just force you into fighting at locations along the road even if you don't need or want to. Obviously this game is all about combat, so that's nothing unusual, but I do sometimes find myself wishing that these surprise encounters would more consistently drop loot worthy of the challenge involved in clearing them. Because there are situations when you don't really get much more than the relief of not having your run end right there. Maybe that's asking for too much, given the appeal of this kind of game, but it's kind of like the change to hero pads, where taking some of the randomization out of the system and allowing the player to make more meaningful choices with substantial outcomes tends to lead to a more satisfying experience. There are a handful of other elements that are still in a rough spot, but I'll leave off criticizing those much, as we're still in early access, and I know that the controversial affinity system in particular has been slated for major updates. It's another one of those mechanics that could benefit from more direct player interaction, because when it works well, but that's not always the case, and it often doesn't feel like there's a lot you can do about that. All in all, I do think Darkest Dungeon 2 is shaping up to be a very fun game. Its runs are long, but never repetitive, and it captures the aesthetic and tactical decision-making that I believe gave the original game so much of its appeal, while also not really punishing the player on the same macro, cross-run level as its predecessor. I've sunk quite a few hours into DD2 over the past year, and if you're a fan of Darkest Dungeon, or just turn-based RPGs like this and haven't checked it out, I'd recommend giving it a try, or at least keeping up with the game as it continues through early access on its way to a full release. Even with only 2 of its 5 chapters currently available, I've never felt like DD2 has lacked for content. So if that's something you're concerned about, I can say confidently that there's plenty to do in the game, even now. I've even recorded several of my runs, and put together a commentated run video after each major content update to make available for my patrons, to give them a better idea of what DD2 is like and how each of the added or updated features work. I wouldn't call myself a good Let's Player or anything like that, but if you enjoyed this video or just find my channel interesting in general, I'd love it if you subscribed and supported me over on Patreon. And in doing so, you get more Darkest Dungeon 2 content on top of early access for all my major videos. The Patreon link's down in the description, as is the link to Darkest Dungeon 2's Epic Games page if you'd like to try the game out for yourself. Thank you all for watching, and please don't forget to leave a like and comment on what you think about Darkest Dungeon 2, whether you're playing it now or if you're holding off until the final release. Au revoir!